I was recently looking at this thread on Facebook, and I'll share a link in the video description. In fact, I'll list all my sources for this video in the video description. But this thread was on a topic of Jews running across a spectrum of morphologies. And in the comment section of the post, someone seemed to attempt to rebut that suggestion by quoting the Song of Songs, specifically Song of Songs 1:5, seemingly treating the verse as referring to Solomon. So I left a brief reply noting that while the historical Solomon may well have had a morphology which modern Americans would consider quote-unquote black, whatever that means, if we were to read the text literally, and note the condition there, you don't have to read the text literally, but if we were to read the text literally, then that is not Solomon speaking in that verse. And, after posting that comment, I felt like making a brief video which discusses the biblical work known as the Song of Songs, or al-Shirim in Hebrew. I just want to touch on the broad strokes of reading the text literally, and in keeping with the historical interpretations, not so literally. See, the book has multiple speakers, hence why it switches back and forth between grammatical genders from section to section. There are portions which speak in the feminine, in which the speaker addresses her counterpart as masculine, and conversely, there are portions which speak in the masculine, in which the speaker addresses his counterpart as feminine. In short, if read literally, the text is a dialogue between a man and a woman. And then there's also occasional portions which are rendered in the plural, as if there's an audience or even a chorus on the side. Now, with that in mind, Songs 1:5 is one of those passages in which the speaker is feminine, speaking in the feminine, hence why the text reads, Shechorah ani, not Shechor, Shechorah ani, I am dark, with the adjective in the feminine. So if we were to read the text literally, this is not the man Solomon speaking, rather it's the female speaker. Or if you think the text involves Solomon, it's Solomon's female counterpart. But honestly, that's a big if. And something I find a bit awkward about 20th and 21st century debates over the Song of Songs is that, with all due respect, they happen within the logic of what might be described as a very low church, very modern Protestant approach. And as a disclaimer, I don't mean that in any sort of disrespectful way to my Protestant friends, nor do I apply that to all Protestants. As I'm going to touch on in a bit, more high church, liturgically minded Protestants took a rather different approach and take a rather different approach. And you'll see this reflected in a certain famous 17th century Anglican translation, as well as one of the earliest Protestant translations into Spanish. Nonetheless, in the 20th and 21st centuries, there's an approach to the Song of Songs which might be more specifically associated with our low church Protestant friends, our modern evangelical friends, who might differ from our high church Anglican friends insofar that they are, let's say, less open to the idea of mystery and less liturgical and more literalist in their approach to the text. And this sort of low church Protestant approach to the Song of Songs dominates discussions on the book. It even dominates discussions on the text between Christians and Muslims, like, for example, on the 5th chapter. It also the logic of it seems to dominate discussions between mainstream Christians and Hebrew Israelites, for example, when discussing Psalms 1:5. And I've even seen this trend in conversations involving mainstream Jews. But simply reading the text literally is not the only option, nor has it been a consistently historically dominant one. On your screen is how the Song of Songs appeared in that aforementioned famous 17th century Anglican translation, the wildly popular King James Version of 1611. You'll notice that each chapter begins with a description provided by the translators, elucidating how the translators understood the text. For example, at the start of chapter 1, which you see here, the header states that the text expresses the church's love to Christ. And in reference to verse 5, it states that the church is confessing her deformity. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But the point is that the King James translators, who themselves were high church Anglicans, understood the Song of Songs as not being a dialogue merely between Solomon and one of his many women, but rather as a dialogue between Christ and his church. And that was likewise the historical Catholic understanding of the text as well. So, too, we see something similar in the opening to the Song of Songs in the 1569 edition of the Reina-Valera Bible, which, as I said earlier, was an early Protestant translation into Spanish. The text is described as un perpetuo dialogo entre la Iglesia Cristiana y su esposo, Cristo, a perpetual dialogue between the Christian church and her spouse, Christ. And the introduction goes on to describe the verses as containing alegorías y semejanzas de cosas al primer parecer unas absurdas, allegories and similitudes which at first seem like absurdities. And there's a parallel in the historical rabbinic Jewish understanding of the text. And so, for example, this is my copy of Mikrot Gedolot to Shir HaShirim, which I may show in a future video. But for now, I just want to open it up and turn to the introduction of one of the most famous rabbinic commentators, Rashi. Rashi says in the opening of his commentary on the text that it is Lehakadosh Baruch Hu me'et adato ve'amo Knesset Yisrael, which is to say that the text is to the Holy One, blessed be He, from His congregation and His people, the gathering of Israel. In short, just as a long-standing Christian view of the text was that it is a mystical dialogue between Christ and the church, there has been somewhat of a parallel, somewhat similar Jewish view, which historically understood the text as an esoteric dialogue between God and Israel. Now, at this point, one might wish to say, wait, if the female speaker can be understood to be Israel, then in Songs 1:5, one can say it is not Solomon speaking, rather it is Israel. It is Israel which is describing herself as black. What I would say here is that each reader is free to understand the text how they please. But I would note that once we understand the Song of Songs as being either a dialogue between Christ and the church, or alternatively a dialogue between God and Israel, at that point it becomes a dizzying array of metaphors. For example, what does it mean for God to kiss Israel with his lips? And what might the breasts and navel of Israel refer to? Clearly, under such a reading, the text becomes highly metaphorical, and then one is left to wonder, is the darkness alluded to in Songs 1:5 literal within such a context, or might it too be metaphorical? So, that turning back to a text that we looked at earlier, I have to ask, were you scandalized when you saw that the King James translator's heading describing verse 5 in the first chapter as referring to a certain quote-unquote deformity? Did that seem inappropriate? And if so, perhaps one might still be thinking too literally. This would not be a physical deformity. Rather, it would be a spiritual deformity in which the darkness being described is an allusion to sin, hence why the female speaker asks others not to look down upon her. Now, I'll stop here, but I just want to say that I understand if others find this uncomfortable. This can strike right at the heart of questions about the accessibility of Scripture to the common man, and thus perhaps to the very perspicuity of Scripture. How one understands the Song of Songs can reflect and even inform, it can even sometimes have an effect on one's approach to an understanding of the rest of the Bible. You see, a person who believes that the text is merely a collection of compliments traded between Solomon and one of his many women is likely to see the rest of the Bible as only teaching that which is explicit and on the surface. However, alternatively, one who sees the Song of Songs as containing a myriad of metaphors and allegories might be willing to approach the rest of the Bible with the understanding that Scripture can have multiple layers of meaning, including references to things not immediately apparent from a surface reading of the text. And therefore, I understand that one's approach to the Song of Songs reflects and informs one's approach to the Bible at large, and thus different people will be more comfortable with one approach and less comfortable with another approach, and that's fine. To each their own. But I just wanted to be clear that if one is going to discuss the Song of Songs, they should be clear about their approach, not only to others, but also to be clear about it to themselves, as both literal and metaphorical approaches to the text have their own sets of implications. And on that note, I'll close this video here. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
Nor do I believe that any of these verses can only be taken at one level. If the Quran has a world of tafsir and ta'wil, then the Bible could have a world of tafsir and ta'wil. If the Quran can have literally a grammatical meaning, a reason for revelation, and layers of meaning, so could a verse of the Bible.